for the Brand Asset Valuator, or more commonly known, the BAV, which is a tool to assess your brand strength, and I think more importantly, to figure out where to go from wherever you are as a brand. And we'll talk about that. But first, we'll have a little message for you. All right, and we have one more householding item here before we go, and that is the continuing education credits. You can get those, but only if you give us your email address to send them to, and to send us some questions. There will be some pop-ups you have to respond to, but more importantly for us here, we want to know what you're interested in, so please send us your questions. And with that, I want to talk to Michael and Sandrine. Welcome
Thank you.
to the studio here.
Thank you.
Michael, you are a brand strategist at heart. You've got the PhD and the Emmy Awards and Cannes. I'm getting jealous to prove it. But you're also and there I need my reading glasses, you lead the VMLYNR Quantitative Insights Practice. Where's the branding in that? We'll talk about that in a second. But more importantly for our conversation, you're the CEO of the Brand Asset Valuator.
Yes.
Which is, I guess, a tool really for brand strategists and brand builders that has been around for a long time. We'll talk about that. So welcome again. And Sandrine, you're from Quebec.
Yes.
Hence the Sandrine, no Sandrine. You're also a strategist, a brand strategist, and you've studied social and psychology, the behavior of consumers. So you're using the data, but you're looking really more into what's behind it.
Exactly.
Excellent. So wonderful qualification there as well. And you studied at NYU. I have a little bias for NYU teaching there. So Michael, how did the Brand Asset Valuator, which has been around for a long time, how did it get started? What was the motivation?
Oh, sure. So it started out actually where Young and Rubicam Y&R Advertising and some of its sister companies needed an edge in the 27 years ago in terms of pitching and winning client businesses. And it was a time when data was not chic and big data was not a buzzword, and Y&R always had this kind of strategic and Gallup worked for Y&R very much about understanding consumers, and so it was an investment, and we actually did not sell BAV consulting work for the first 15 years of the product. It was more making our agency smarter.
It was later kind of separated out of the agency. Now, you have a chart up there. I'm always surprised. You showed this to my students as well. Tens of thousands of brands. Really?
We in the U.S., for instance, we measure 4,000 brands each year. Around the world, there's different brands in different markets. So,
right.
So while in the U.S. we're measuring 4,000, there might be another 1,000 distinct brands we're measuring in China, or so on and so forth. We've been doing this for 27 years. So we're always in field, basically. We're always on, and we're always collecting data and information on how consumers perceive brands.
Right. And I guess one of the advantages here is you're able to look at things over time.
Oh, absolutely.
Which we're going to talk about.
Yeah, not just brands, but motivations.
Right. Which brings me to you, Sandrine. There are these 4 famous measures, or at least that's what every marketing student kind of has to learn. For those who don't remember their class, can you tell us what are those all about?
Absolutely. So when we measure brand equity at BAV, we look at 4 key metrics. The first one is differentiation. How special is your brand? How unique is your brand, not only against key competitors, but also against the full brandscape? The second one is relevance, which is how relevant or appropriate is a brand to your consumers. The third one is esteem, which relates to respect. How respected is your brand? Is it highly regarded or poorly regarded? And the last one is knowledge. So how familiar people are with a brand. And when we combine the two first metrics, differentiation and relevance, we get brand strength, which is basically, which tells us about how the potential growth of a brand. A brand who has high brand strength is a brand that is really unique and also really relevant.
Tends to have a lot of energy in the marketplace.
Right.
Exactly. And when we look at the two other metrics, regard and knowledge, we get brand stature. Brands that have high statures or brands that are well established, well known, really credible. So looking at brand strength and brand stature, we really can understand brand equity.
How do you collect that data? Is it a standardized process or?
So we have a survey. We're basically all constantly fielding. And in the survey, we have approximately 70 metrics. And then that covers the four brand equity metrics: differentiation, relevance, esteem, and knowledge. We also look at a brand meaning. We measure brands on 48 attributes. So for example, is your brand helpful? Is your brand charming, glamorous, and so on? So we have 48 attributes. And we also measure brand advocacy, so usage, preference.
And are there some archetypes? Are there some typical patterns you see?
You tend to see archetypical types of brands out there. Absolutely, we have a baked-in archetype model that uses these attributes to look at warrior brands or jester brands or so on, or matriarchs. It's one of the ways you can cut data. It works for certain brands, but it's you do see standard patterns and types of brands that exist out there, and you can start to classify them. It's quite fascinating.
Right. And I remember you saying in class that these scores kind of reflect not only a brand's identity, but also its position in culture, if you like.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So first of all, when we look at these metrics, either imagery or equity or advocacy, we're looking at where your brand ranks in culture, literally. So in the U.S., where do you rank versus 4,000 brands at any one given time? So it's a bit of a cultural perspective of the U.S. brandscape, as we call it. And yeah, so you could dig in and start to understand, first of all, how does it play in this category? Is it the premium brand? So is it rolled to deliver higher order quality, or is it about accessibility? So brands tend to take on the roles that reflect their meaning. Some brands are about badge, and they're not about substance. So, and you could see that different types of relationships consumers have with brands affects who they are in culture. Now, it's also about how the brand behaves in culture. So if you're about, being kind and conscientious, your Kind Bar, for instance, a client I work with, you better be doing things out there in terms of your kind experience around helping the world. Exactly. So brands have to live in culture just as much as they have to live in the minds of consumers.
So as we say a lot in class, increasingly actually, particularly with the watchful eye of social media and the millions and billions of people watching, you need to actually act out and be what you say you are.
Absolutely.
Do you see that reflected in the data?
Sometimes. I think some brands do an amazing job of leveraging social to reflect and build their brands. Other brands, that they do everything on TV or radio, and their social presence is very functional.
Right.
Ideally, you get them to work well together.
Right. And have you seen some trends over the years, how maybe the profiles develop? Was there a typical profile of the 90s and now there's the profile of 2020?
You definitely see differences. Just even thinking about something like millennials. Millennials 20 years ago, but they weren't called millennials. Young people 20 years ago, it was about badge, it was about style, it was about you wanted to stand out. You look at young people today, it's about transparency and simplicity and pragmatism. So you do see shifts, at least in the U.S., in terms of the motivations. We also see shifting trends on what's important. Like, it used to all be about, you think about branding in the early days, it was about trust. So everybody talks about trust, and trust is a struggle right now. But over the years, I've seen different patterns. Like, for a while, every brand was focused on being a navigator brand. And then brands were focusing on being real. If you notice, if you look at advertising 10 years ago, real this, real that, real. The buzzword, and it's real, it's not just a buzzword actually, is purpose. Every brand wants to be purposeful, and that's a great thing. sometimes you see the purpose of these brands and they're not quite realistic, but that is something that's more important today than ever before, and we can see it quantitatively.
And it's a good plug for our next MNC watch, actually, because we'll have Jim Stengel here, the master of purpose.
Yes.
So we're going to challenge him a little bit
Okay,
on,
good.
are there several types of purpose and what's a real purpose versus a not so real one. So as you look at these developments over time, is there some competitive bunching as well, as we used to call it? Like you seem to imply that everyone moving to one quadrant versus the other, or how do you see it, and what do you counsel brands then when you see it?
Well, so if you believe in differentiation, I'm like, okay, those things are becoming more important. That's great. Own those things. So if the trend is real, lean into it. Sure, if you can do it authentically, but you also have to find a way to. What's your top spin? What's your tension against that, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. But you can't just follow the category trend. You have to redefine the category trend.
So when we look at, I see the chart here. You have like differentiation winners like Uber Eats or SoulCycle. And you compare it to like a Wells Fargo. What's the? I guess it's an extreme. Yes. What's the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses in these profiles?
Exactly. So we talked about the 4 key metrics a little bit earlier. I think what's really interesting is to look at the relationship between those 4 key metrics. A brand that has higher differentiation than relevance is a brand that has unrealized potential. So it's a brand that has captured the attention of consumers, but still needs to be more relevant, more meaningful to consumers. And that's the case of a SoulCycle, for example, or an Uber Eats among all adults. It's very unique, but still needs to fill the gap with relevance. However, if we look at what you mentioned earlier with Wells Fargo, it's a brand that has higher knowledge than esteem. So it means that people know about the brand, but don't really respect what they know.
Right. Okay. And that's an interesting example of a brand that, when it got into trouble, it gained on knowledge and lost on esteem.
Everyone knew about Wells Fargo, but not for a good reason.
Exactly.
Okay. So is the ideal to score high on everything, or how should we see that?
I think it depends on the brand's business model. I think that upper left pattern, you're looking at differentiation greater than relevance. Some brands want to stay that way. They want to be niche brands and they want to own that and not be for everybody.
Or at least perceived niche brands, because many of those supposed niche brands like a Red Bull or a Mini Car or an Nespresso are billion-dollar brands and leaders in their category.
Absolutely.
But everyone, at their own peril, when their competitors think they are niche brands, right?
Yes, absolutely. So it is about so I find lots of clients come to us that look like the upper right. They're relevant, they're respected. Lots of Fortune 500 companies we talk about have that great relevance or esteem. But without that differentiation, you're at risk of fatigue and commoditization. And it's about finding that balance in a brand.
So is there a different profile you should shoot for, maybe by category? Like, would you want a different profile for, let's say, an insurance company versus a lingerie company, or is it really agnostic?
Good question.
Please.
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, what we've seen is that all 4 the patterns or the importance of the pillar relationships stay intact across categories. I've looked at multiple hundreds of categories, and being different makes a difference. Absolutely. If you slip in this team, it's going to affect your consideration. So no matter what the category is, the same fundamental brand building dynamics tend to exist. It's how you drive those pillars and how you influence it that vary by category. So it's the meaning behind that's more, you have to think about by category. But overall, brands tend to build the same way regardless of the category.
Yeah, I think you don't have to be a tech brand in order to be a leader, a momentum leader.
Absolutely.
We studied the brand Swiffer, for example, who is it's an accessible brand. It's a CPG brand, but it's also very innovative, which again drives that differentiation that we want.
Right. And one interesting aspect is, as we said earlier, that you're tracking these over the years, right? So you've got, I don't know, with some brands, I guess, a 15-year track record.
20 years, yeah.
Do you discover patterns, and what's the meaning of them?
Yeah, you do see trends, absolutely, by sector, or sometimes sectors change. If I looked at 20 years ago at the most dynamic QSR brands, it would be Taco Bell and Pizza Hut.
Quick service.
Quick service, yes, quick service restaurants, thank you. Today, they've been pushed into a commodity box. And local, small, intimate brands are the ones that are creating the excitement. So you do see absolutely shifting trends that become important. And again, it depends on the category.
Right. And I think, do you have you had a slide there, I forgot, was it Netflix or something like
Oh,
that? That
yes.
was
Oh,
interesting in terms of that pattern. I don't know.
We'll go back. We'll get to it after maybe.
oh, there it is. Perfect.
Oh, yes.
All right.
Please.
So that I found intriguing.
Yes.
Can you explain what we see here?
Sure. So this is a great example of disruption. And Netflix, by the way, was not so disruptive in 2005.
Right.
I would argue that Blockbuster, so Netflix was sitting up in that niche, differentiated but untapped. Blockbuster was still a beast back then. They were strong, credible, respected, and with pretty decent differentiation. They just didn't react. You know, Netflix was just doing mail order CDs. It wasn't so novel. Blockbuster had a lot of opportunity to own that marketplace, and they didn't. They just kept on doing the same things that they were doing. They didn't move with the times, and you could see the trajectory of a brand like Netflix. I call this attack from the fringe because you see this in every category. These smaller players start up with all this untapped energy,
Right.
and over time they kind of start to chip away at the big players. Now, it doesn't mean the big players aren't going to stay the biggest, but you'll see eroding market share typically.
Right. So what I see here is that Blockbuster seems to have started out quite high on the stature, kind of.
Yes.
So it was an esteemed brand, let's
Right.
put it, whereas Netflix, I guess, was a little bit of a rebel in there
Oh, no question.
that had
Very differentiated.
maybe differentiation, but not much knowledge and
Exactly.
esteem in the
Exactly.
population. And now we find ourselves where Netflix is actually at the very high end of everything.
Absolutely.
Everyone knows it, everyone knows about it, likes it, and it's still perceived as the most relevant. Is
Absolutely.
that how we read this?
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Netflix 15 years ago was a SoulCycle, and now it's in Amazon.
Right, right. Do you have trends like that you would see over categories or countries, or um, can we see things over time?
Sure.
I think, yes, so I think that we found that through 26 years of studying brands, brands tend to grow in a typical pattern, I would say.
Right.
Although it varies, but brands often start in the indifference, so low on all patterns, in the indifference quadrant.
Which would be the lower level.
Exactly.
Yes.
So there you have brands that are either unknown or brands that are outdated.
Or
like,
lost away. Yeah, MySpace.
like MySpace.
MySpace.
No one
You got
uses-
the brands actually there.
Yeah,
Yes.
MySpace
Yes.
was on the upper right 15 years or whatever many years ago
So it
was.
moved back, if you like.
Yes.
Okay, it regressed.
So there's a
back.
pattern.
Okay.
But yes.
Exactly. Once a brand gains momentum, it moves up to the curiosity quadrant. So here you see that the pillars take on a reverse step down pattern. So high differentiation, gaining on relevance, lower esteem, and knowledge. And then once a brand continues to grow, it moves over to the right, to the leadership quadrant. And like a Coca-Cola, for example,
Right,
it's a mass market
No,
leader.
I'm surprised a bit. I would have thought that Tesla by now would be pretty high on knowledge as well. So might it be that with the 2020
Sure.
survey, it moves over to the right here?
Yeah, it has been moving, but the reality is everybody knows Tesla, but not everybody knows it well. Right?
Okay.
So our knowledge metric is just not do you know it
So
or not.
salience is not enough. It needs to be filled with some attributes.
Exactly.
How much you
Right.
know.
When you drive it and you've experienced it, then you really know it. Right now, people are like, yeah, that's Tesla. It's cool. It's interesting.
Right.
Check out that
So
screen.
let's talk about the gap here,
Mhm.
because unfortunately, a lot of the former kings and queens of categories, as I call them, borrowing from Budweiser, the king of beers, are no longer the kings and the queens. A, how does it happen? Is it immediate? Do you see it creep down? And B, have you seen great turnarounds?
Sure. Sure. First of all, so brands can be evergreen. I mean, Nike, Disney have been on the upper right for 25 years. But at the same time, we see as brands build and they start to build awareness, they start to lose some of their specialness. So you definitely see brands moving in a clockwise rotation around this chart here, where they have this pent-up differentiation, and people are intrigued. They want to get to know it, and then they're like, okay, that's cool. Okay, that's not so special. And sometimes they start to fade down to that lower right, where Gap is. Gap was on the upper right for many years, and they oversold. They became really commoditized and fatigued over time, and disrupted by new, retail. But brands move in other directions. I think we have a slide. Is that after that?
Yes.
Sorry. Brands making money by it. Okay, let's leave it. Yeah.
Okay.
Point is, brands can come back too. Brands can move up. Brands can move down. Brands can. So that while they tend to move in a clockwise way, brands can disrupt and redefine and re-energize all the time.
So in your quadrants, you ideally turn back the time. You move it.
Ideally.
You turn back at least to try and stay in the upper corner. So what do we see here?
Sure.
Can you explain that?
Sure. Okay. So take a brand like Dunkin Donuts.
Right.
Great example of and there's lots of ways brands can re-energize themselves.
Right.
Dunkin Donuts was a great example of a brand that everybody liked and everybody knew it, obviously, but they were selling donuts in a healthy world. They realized that they sold more coffee than anybody.
Right.
And all they really did was change their purpose. So they were a donut brand, and now they were fueling America on coffee. And they changed their role in the minds of consumers. They didn't really change their products at that time. They just changed what their purpose was in the marketplace, and it really re-energized who they were. And you could see a substantial increase in differentiation and relevance over time because of that. So brands can move up in that direction and recover. Converse did that. Burberry did that. And I love to see that because I work with lots of different clients, and I don't want to be like, oh, you're fatigued, you're done. No, you could find other ways to re-energize yourself.
Well, the other thing that this reminds me of is one, I'm surprised how many students talk again about Dunkin. You know, you would see totally uncool, but there can be a coolness about vintage, if you like, when it's being turned around. I mean, just think about, you know, Pop's Blue Ribbon. And then I see Ford here, which might not be the students in this case, so it might not be the famous millennial, at least not the urban one, but maybe the F-150 pickup truck, etc., that does the reputation. Well, is that right? So it really depends also on your segment and on your fans?
No question. And products could do that. I think Ford also benefited from not taking the bailout, and they were, you know, and Americana, but yes, product-wise, you can absolutely drive the equity of brands. I've seen many cases where product brands are often stronger than the parent brand. In this case, Ford's tangled up with this product brand, so it gets that dual credit.
Right, right. Now, we do have these factors that you talk about, the differentiation and the relevance, and on the other side, the esteem and the knowledge, but it's much more tricky than that, right? Because saying, I want to be esteemed or I want to be different is one thing. Do you also have insights into how to achieve differentiation or knowledge or esteem?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we've studied lots of brands, and I've always been fascinated by brands that are able to break away and disrupt even in the most commoditized categories. And so if you think about our model, we talk about, you know, the most successful brands have brand strength. They're different and they're relevant. But mathematically, being different and being relevant are at odds. They're negatively correlated. You can be relevant by lowering your price, by making it really accessible. That's not going to make you more differentiated. You could be different by being bold, but maybe not relevant to people.
Right.
The brands that are able to bridge that tension, and we call that brand intensity, between being different and being relevant are the ones that disrupt and break away. And there's some really obvious examples of brands that do that. On this chart, for instance, you think about supermarkets. The most mundane category, I apologize to the supermarkets out there, the most commoditized category. But brands like Trader Joe's are disrupting that, and they have lots of differentiation there. And as a result of that, they're creating much deeper consumer advocacy. And we see that all the time. We call this brand intensity.
And Joe Coulombe just died on Friday. He is the original Trader Joe. And it reminded me, because I studied this brand quite a bit, that a fundamental human insight can drive brand success for ages. Because he started out in the early 60s with an insight of people get more educated, air travel prices come down, so people travel more, but still they cannot afford to go to the delicatessen store, even less to a French restaurant or whatever every day. So he had this insight of making sophisticated foods available, and it's still growing strong, if not stronger than ever, all these years later, 50 years later. So there seem to be fundamentals, if you pick them up, that can really drive your strength for a long time.
Yeah, and they're a great example of a brand that took a chore, like grocery shopping, and made it fun and made it adventurous. Right. And that's where their tension came from.
Right.
Absolutely.
And you have legendary brands here, Southwest, and a new legendary like Airbnb, but then you also have very mundane things like Swiffer. Can you tell us a little bit more about Swiffer?
Again, so Swiffer is a great example of a very accessible brand that's also really innovative, right? So and I would say that's a tension of value and innovation. That's rare, right? Because innovation is usually expensive. So they're all about inexpensive innovation, and they're another brand that honestly made something as mundane and boring as cleaning exciting again and fun. They brought some energy to it, and because of that innovativeness, they have much stronger scores on differentiation than any other cleaning product in the category.
Right, right. Excellent. So what?
Yeah, we could show you some intensity examples of just
Yes.
the
So
power
you were
of
talking. What does it mean, tensity?
So tensity, it comes from the idea of how can a brand be different and relevant at the same time.
Right.
When we know that they're at odds. And great brands do it time after time. And that's how we work when I work with VML Y&R as an agency and we were working with a client. We look for that tensity, which is typically innate to the brand. Marilyn Monroe, still doing advertising today, by the way. She was seductive and beautiful, but she was also naive and innocent. And that's an interesting tensity that makes her just still resonate today. Dr. Seuss, one of my favorites, and he said this, his secret sauce was logical insanity. It's a great tension there.
It seems like a Target, cheap, chic
kind
of.
I've worked with Target for a very long time.
Target.
They brought Target brought value and style and a little bit of smarts together, and they were a commodity brand in 1997. Right. They are no longer a commodity brand, obviously, and because they.
I ran the Frédéric Fekkai business for a while, and so I work with Frédéric, and always discussion, very interesting discussion. And when you asked him about, what's the secret to Frédéric Fekkai, particularly at the beginning, and he always talked about, you make beautiful hair, coiffé, as he said. And then what you need to do before you walk out, you need to go through the hair and mess it up a bit. And he called it coiffé, décoiffé, which means you make it attractive. You create this intensity. You look very stylish and all made up, but then you ruffle it up a bit and people wonder what's happening here.
Right.
So that's a little bit the secret sauce there.
I think the brands that we all know and love the most, I think, get it intuitively and they find that. It needs to be authentic to the brand, but it's in there. You just have to find it and bring it out.
It's the je ne sais quoi.
Exactly.
What is it exactly? All right, so Marvel is another
great. I'm a big Marvel fan. I have 2 boys, and we watch a lot of Marvel movies.
Oh, and here we even have Target.
Yeah, but so Marvel is a great example of, and I think it's an interesting comparison to DC. DC was a bit dark and almost traditional comic book style and one-dimensional, where Marvel came in and it was about this humble but extraordinary characters. They all had vulnerabilities. They weren't like superheroes. They were human superheroes, and that tensity made them so interesting. And you see that all the time in those great brands. Some of the brands I've worked with, again, Target, Cheap Chic's intensity, which led to Design for All, right? It came right out of that. Dell's a client we work with our agency. It's about everyman entrepreneur. Part of it, they have B2B as well. But again, leaning into both sides, instead of saying, well, we're about value, no, we're about empowering entrepreneurs. And it's a different way of talking about your brand and elevating it. Milano's is a fun one because it comes from heritage of Pepperidge Farm and trust. But Milano's is about lust and that dark chocolate. So leaning into trust and lust created this nice duality that made it so exciting.
It seems to me it's a bit of a human trait.
Oh, no question.
And it's a little bit of teenagers struggle more than others, and we all want to be staying young. So this kind of bringing in this tension, bringing in these questions. If you think of fashion brands, they always do things to disrupt themselves, or even luxury brands. Louis Vuitton might all of a sudden spray paint their stores or work with Supreme. I guess it's part of the staying current, staying relevant, almost a little bit self-destruction just to rebuild yourself that plays in here.
Yeah, particularly in luxury, because luxury, the old world of luxury, is not the same. It's not just about being classy and status. You could be luxurious and about performance. Or we did a lot of work with Land Rover. Their tension was hardworking luxury. It's a different way of expressing it. So it's finding those nuances to really separate yourself.
Now we get some questions from the audience, and of course, sometimes to my frustration, the first question is always about, but what about social media? What does social media do in all of this?
Sure.
You've also heard that question, I guess.
Oh, yes.
More than once.
Yes.
So you have a social media component to this now. Explain.
Sure. Well, I'll let you explain in a second, but I just want to say one thing first. So even how we are as a company, Y&R was an advertising agency, and VML, which Y&R and VML merged, was a digital company, all about social and digital activation. You can't be one or the other, and we brought the two together, VML, Y&R, and it's very successful, and because you're playing both sides of it. You have to be where the consumer is, and it's not just on the shelf, obviously. I'll let you talk a little bit more
But
about
before we do that,
Sure.
a question that burns in my mind. So I tend to see that agencies that tell other people how to brand themselves
Yes.
are doing a terrible job themselves. How can you name yourself VLM?
VNLYNR, rolls off the tongue. Absolutely. Oh, you know what? I think it was just out of respect to the two agencies that came in there. YNR, the history, and it's so important. We didn't want, and that's why we ended it with YNR and that ampersand. It meant something. But we also wanted to reflect that, there were a new company and a new vision and a new energy. So I think you needed both pieces of it. We make fun of ourselves.
So there we
sometimes.
have
That's okay.
there we have a
Exactly.
brand story. I was
Yeah.
going to say, why not name yourself John, Oscar, Susie, or Billy, because
Exactly.
that seems to be the thing nowadays.
Yes,
All
absolutely.
right. So, but we're talking social media.
Yes.
So tell us about that component.
So here we see we cannot look at a brand equity in isolation. We started BAV Social around 5 years ago, and because we've realized that social should be taken into account when we look at a brand equity.
Right.
It's such a big part of a brand's equity. And there was all this data out there that we, as BAV, we were like, we need to work with this data and we need to analyze this data. So you can tell more
Sure,
about
yeah,
what we do more specifically.
Yeah, it was something, I oversee this, largest study of brands out there, but I'm like, oh my God, we have all this other brand data
Right.
because people are talking about brands. How can I not be mining that? So
And there seem to be increasingly kind of the official traditional channels, whether it's in media or conversation, and then there are the kind of social media and even increasingly the underground channels. So just yesterday, I finished class at Columbia for the semester, and students told me, Professor, you won't see your real scores because they give student feedback. I said, what do you mean? Well, because there's an app that only students have access to, where the real conversation happens about you.
Yes.
So you're accessing this kind of data?
You have to. Yes. No. The problem we
Can
had.
I look my BAV score up here?
We could actually we could. We
can
did some
measure
work
you.
with politicians. We just
You did?
We
All right.
just did a little article with Fortune magazine on politics, and you can quantify their equity. The issue is nobody really knew what are the variables that matter, and is it likes? What does that really mean to you if a lot of people follow you or like you? And the problem is there were no anchoring principles to what does this all mean. So what we did was we took 10 years of brand data from BAV and 10 years of social data, and we started to model the social data against brand building fundamentals. So we could start to quantify what are the social equity metrics that we should start tracking that actually drive brand success. It's not social for the sake of social. It's social for the sake of building my brand
Right.
and building a deeper connection with my consumer.
Which
So-
a lot of brands are now admitting that they were so hung up on getting the likes, on getting
Yeah.
the posts out, on having that rhythm of at least 3 times a day, forgetting about the brand. I think Adidas, if I'm right, outed itself almost saying we need to rethink. I mean,
yeah.
we build up a huge social media machine, but we don't see any return in terms of equity building.
We think of social as brand building. We think, and sometimes we start with social, and sometimes that's the only place you should be. Other times it's a great balance of the two. We quantify social dynamics.
Right.
We talk about differentiation in BAV.
Right.
In social, we have a metric called vitality. That's a social equity metric that drives differentiation in the
Right.
marketplace. When you think about relevance in BAV, which is important to consideration, in social we have involvement. It's not just do I like you, but it's how deep do I go with you and engage with you. We measure esteem in BAV, we measure mood in social. Mood's interesting because quite often nobody's saying, I love my Apple phone. But what happens with Apple is...
It might happen with Apple, but I love my Olay shower gel.
Right. But if you love your Olay shower gel and somebody else says Olay is horrible, I like this brand, and you really love Olay, you're going to go back and defend it.
Right.
So that's what's in
Right.
mood is that discussion, that debate around the brand that you want
Right.
to elevate. So sometimes you can leverage bad.
And do you find, a friend of mine has done some research, and he found that for every one person who says good about your brand, you get at least 5 people, if
Yeah.
not more, who say bad. So you need to value actually those who defend
Who are
you
advocate
much
of your
more.
brand,
Is
exactly.
that something
Yeah.
you find as well?
Yeah, we control for that. We standardize data because you're always going to get more negatives than positives.
Okay.
But it's looking at the
So I
responses.
shouldn't
and
feel too bad.
You shouldn't feel. I'm going to do a report on you. We'll see how you're doing.
Excellent. So yeah, so tell us about how Tensity and
Sure.
does it translate to social media?
Sure. So here's a great example. A client that's dear to our hearts because one of our agency clients, and
I
think
thought
it's a
because you go there every
good,
lunchtime.
you know what? It's a good. When I'm driving up to Vermont, it's a good place to stop. But this is a brand, and why I love this case, it's a brand that had so much heritage and so much history, and it was seen as old school, traditional, innocent, and it had this nice innocence to it. A girl with
We're
pintails.
talking about Wendy's.
Wendy's.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
And what we did as an agency, we didn't walk away from that. We didn't try, oh, we're not that Wendy's, we're new Wendy's. We said, let's lean into that, but let's create some tension against that. And the voice of the brand, and it was all led by social media, was this innocent irreverence, that push-pull. So it was, yes, we kind of, but we meet it in a lighthearted way, and that duality created this social voice that really drove the brand in the digital space, but then it ended up defining the brand's voice in traditional media. And so we actually led with social, and everything else followed behind that. And we really redefined the brand. And if you looked at our equity, you saw an amazing, I think, improvement in differentiation over time. And it was 11% increase in market share year over year. Here's a great example of a brand that is so. It actually improved a lot of data here. So the first thing is you saw amazing increases in brand differentiation by really leaning into that duality. And I'm sure many of you have seen the kind of work we did.
That's the left-hand score here
Yes.
that
Yes.
goes up significantly.
Right.
Yes.
So, but all that movement in differentiation was driven by what we were doing in the social space. Nugs for Carter, where we, or on National Roast Day, we roasted other QSR brands, quick service restaurant brands. So we just kind of leading into that, and again, in an innocent and irreverent way, and you can see what happened to the brand, an increase in differentiation driven by major increases in social equity. So
Right.
social equity drove brand equity in this case. It works both ways, but this is a great example of when you get the two to work together, it can be really disruptive.
Right. So Megan here says, isn't Wendy's all about the founder? I remember those ads. In how far does that kind of weigh on a brand?
It should. It's part of it. You don't want to abandon all the efforts you've done over these years in building a brand. But that's when you talk about the intensity. That's where that innocence comes from. Dave Thomas was about how we make hamburgers in the old days, the innocence, fresh, never frozen. So that part of it is still there, and we didn't walk away from it, but we added top spin to it.
So you should try to integrate this, what I call the brand DNA.
Absolutely.
That's sometimes very deep. I mean, I did a survey in class, and it's amazing. There are a couple of even traditional TV ads, like the 1984 ad by Apple, for example, or Where's the Beef ad. That generation after generation seems to become part of the DNA, kind of handed on, like the good old stories, like the myths, etc. Do you see that reflected in the conversations as well?
Yeah, you will. I think sometimes it's the shock, or they're like, oh my God, and Wendy's did that, because of that innocence, because of that heritage. And again, it's a delicate dance, and you need to do it in a way that's authentic to who you are. So if you just said we're no longer this heritage brand, this innocent brand, and we're something else now, no one would believe you. But they're still that brand, but with an up-to-date voice and a modern tone and a bit of an attitude.
You have to keep that DNA, and when we find the Tensity, we always look at what passionates love about the brand.
Right.
So,
And you can typically find it within the brand.
Right. There's another interesting question here about fast food. It seems that Burger King is doing a lot of things, and including trying to be interesting and relevant with, for example, the Andy Warhol Super Bowl ad, which seems to have completely flopped, though, because they missed their target. It seems like nobody knew anymore who Andy Warhol was. Are those things that they could see anywhere in the data you have, or are there still these areas where it's all about the art and the intuition and the insight, and data can only get you so far?
We practice data-inspired creativity, so I think if you're not understanding the truth about your brand and you're doing creative, it's hit or miss. I think if you understand the guts of a brand and what it stands for and you leverage that, that's great. You use the word tried. They tried to. So they tried to be cool. They tried to be hip, or they tried to...
well, they succeed in other places, right? With their challenges online, they're very successful.
Yes, absolutely. So, but sometimes you stray too far from who you are, And it sounds like, or not taking into consideration, a lot of people don't know Andy Warhol.
Right. Plus, the tonality of that ad was fundamentally different from the kind of very cheeky, kind of humorous prankster kind of.
You can go in lots of different places, but still have that core DNA, as you said, and be consistent with that.
So let me ask you another question from actually students yesterday, which was we talked about M&Ms, and I was in total shock that they didn't know the little M&M characters.
Oh, really? It's too bad.
Then I showed them some ads of 2019 and 2020, and they were all laughing. What's going wrong here?
Probably, I'm curious what their media mix is, what their touch points are. It's it's an immersive experience. It's brand experience, it's consumer experience, and if they're just doing that on TV or they're using social media in places that these consumers are not, or they're not partnering with the right, they're just not getting the message out there. It's about being where and when you need to be, and we talk about being emotionally connected, socially connected. You have to in the right places, and it sounds like they're not in the right places at the right times.
Right. Now, as far as then your social data and your traditional data is concerned, you would pick up on that because that is consumer data. Am I assuming that right?
So both sides are consumer. So BAV is about how do consumers think about your brand, and again, it's like, so what do they love about you? I can figure that out. What are those fundamentals that are driving your brand esteem? What's making you different? And so, first of all, understanding that's great. Understanding people that love you versus people that like you versus people that hate you, and looking at what's driving that gap in advocacy. There's so much insight there. So yes, we're creative and we're inventive, but it's about building that creativity on grounded ideas. It's a lot of money to get a brand out there, and if you're not grounded in insight, then you're taking a chance.
Right. So a lot of, or I usually explain that there is this image that a brand has in the market, and then there is the identity, and that image lives in the mind of consumers. Mm-hmm. And there's the identity, and that lives in the mind of the brand manager or the marketing director, or it sits on a sheet as a pyramid, an equity pyramid, or is included in a brief. Do you have some tips of how to best ensure those two align as much as possible, and it moves from the imagery that everyone wants to have to the actual image in the population?
You have to get them in sync. If the marketers are not thinking the same way,
I guess you get you do briefings, you bring the data. There are many moments of shock, I guess, and disbelief.
Yes, I lost. Well, my agency at the time lost a pitch. It was for, can I say it? It was for Arby's at the time, and the client, and they're pitching in, and they're like, "We're gonna become a healthy brand because everybody's being healthy right now."
Yes.
And
salad. Add salad to the menu.
And so we're going to go after healthy foodie moms or something like that. And so, of course, in any pitch, I would do my due diligence. I'm like, really? You guys are killing it with construction workers. You're killing it with men. And, let's own meat. And they're like, no. I'm like, why? Everything says you should just lean into your strength. And they're like, well, we've been working on this for a year. I'm like, okay. So we did not win the pitch. And strategically, we disagreed with their direction. The only reason why I'm telling that story is so they could not say healthy, so they did a campaign called Good Mood Food, which was supposed to mean healthy. Mm-hmm. It didn't last very long, and now 5 years later, they're all about, we got the meat. So it took them 5 years to catch up with what they should have known 5 years earlier, and it was because in the minds of the marketing people, they wanted to do this, but the consumer saw them completely differently.
Right.
So I'll take that loss to be right, I guess. But
and it seems to me that often marketers, I guess particularly in big organizations where there are many layers of decision taking, are afraid or simply cannot see their way to getting agreement to a position that is very fundamentally about their brand but might not be popular right now. And it seems to me that sometimes the startups then steal the show and everyone is surprised. So we talked about Dove as a great campaign, body positivity, latching onto that trend, driving it, and literally driving billions of dollars worth in value for Unilever. And then everyone jumps on that bandwagon. And then all of a sudden, brands coming out of Canada, of all places, right? Lululemon, etc., that are going into the opposite direction almost, like very proud of this slender, trained alpha female body, etc., and doing the total opposite. Is it true that brands can, if you can participate in the yin game, try the yang, the zig versus the zag?
I think there's always okay to have a little zag, but again, if it's authentic to who you are, I think you shouldn't be shy about leaning into that and celebrating.
True to yourself.
Yeah.
Understanding who you are, your
Right.
DNA, and your point of tension. I think it's all about.
Right.
If you're doing it the same thing everybody else is, you're the same as everybody
Exactly,
else.
and you're not different.
And are there ways to be different even if you are a toilet paper?
Yeah, I think if Swiffer could do it, if a supermarket can do it, any
Absolutely.
brand can do it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a really compelling toilet paper brand at the moment.
Maybe motor. I give you motor oil.
Motor, you can. Bounty, I think Bounty did a pretty good job of standing for something more than a paper towel. It stands for strength. And so they kind of
Right.
did a nice job in, close to toilet paper, I guess.
And
it
been
can be
doing
done.
this again for 30
Yeah.
years
and
on
staying
end.
true to it. So they own an archetype.
Right.
They own that warrior archetype.
What about private label? Increasingly, we have brands, famously now defunct, Brandless, for example, that used to be called private label, and it meant I am the category generic. But increasingly, they take on an identity of their own. Do you have those in the database? Do you see a trend among private or what used to be private label called private label?
Yeah, I think, well, a couple of, it's a vague place, private label. So so Walmart has some really strong private label brands, but are they private label or are they Walmart brands?
What about Kirkland, I think?
Kirkland's a strong brand, I think, and they lean into Newman's Own is a little bit of that as well to create some credibility there. The parent brand where it's at, so being at Costco, that brings a trust mark to their product brand. So I think sometimes these brands, Target's doing a lot around private brands. They lean into the strength of the parent brand, and these private brands, consumers give them credit for those things. They give them respect because they know it's coming from Costco or from Target or so on. Sometimes the private brands can be as strong as the store brands.
Do you find retailers asking you about how brands score before maybe a decision to list them or a decision to retain a brand? Or
Oh, sure. We've done acquisition work with Campbell's and other companies in terms of looking at buying a juice brand in Brazil. The first place I want to look is let's look at the strongest brands. Because you'll see, you're going to see what they give you in terms of their revenue, but let's get under the hood, and there's more to that than just what they're telling you their revenue is. What does the consumer think about you? Because that's about the potential. Some of the biggest revenue brands aren't necessarily the brands with the most momentum. So it's about finding that momentum in the brand. So if there's a momentum, I would say buy the brands on the upper left. Invest in stocks on the brands on the upper left that haven't matured fully yet, but have all that potential.
Like Google buying Nest, for example.
Yeah,
is a great
absolutely.
example.
Yeah.
Sawing this potential.
you kind of already answered this question about is there a brand life cycle? It seems to me that you're saying no. I mean, as long as you can keep turning the clock back and stay in that upper right quadrant, is that the answer to brand life cycle?
For sure. I think that there's a typical lifestyle, and then there are an ample amount of examples of brands that disrupt that life cycle. And that's the exciting part. And that's what I do for a living is disrupt that life cycle. I would, BML Weiner just won Lee. It's a great heritage brand. I'm excited to work on that because has great credibility. It probably needs some differentiation, but it has so much to it in its DNA that we want to celebrate and lean into. So, to me, it's like I love vulnerable brands that are fatigued. I joke around when every time I'm pitching that I specialize in ripping apart brands and finding them at their weakest, because it's the only way you can make them better is to find out what's wrong with them, and then you can find out, okay, let's find what's right for you specifically, and it's always in there. You just have to find it.
You're showing us a chart here. Is that?
This is a great example of Target, which was a value brand in the 80s and 90s.
And right in the same quadrant, I guess, with Walmart and fighting
Back
for
then, very value centric. So they're very relevant, but not very poorly differentiated. They brought value and style together to completely disrupt who they were. And they became Target, and it really redefined its role and purpose in culture. Purely by leaning into partnerships with designers and redefining and innovating around that, completely disrupted who they are. And you can see on this chart here, an amazing reinvigoration of the brand's differentiation particularly when you're in value. Value is very commoditizing. That's the point of intensity. You can talk about value in a way that creates momentum.
Right. Now, in this Walmart example, for example, I happen to know that there are other factors, like, for example, the presence on e-commerce at the time and being behind, developments there, even handing it over to your competitor with Amazon running Target e-commerce and then having a big gap once they ruptured that relationship. In other words, there are many other factors, noise factors, etc. Do you work kind of cross-functionally with R&D or supply chain at your clients to be able to see the fuller picture beyond the mood and the image? Or is there even elements of that coming through actually in the feedback by consumers?
I think you have to surround the brand, including distribution, and find those right partners. So yes, absolutely, you need to understand what does it mean to be on Amazon today? Can your brand matter? And by the way, one thing we saw, an interesting soundbite, among people that shop online, brand is more important than the average consumer because you can pick up the brand and touch and feel it and know the quality of it. So if you know the brand and it's on Amazon, you know it's safe. So
do you really?
Well, you should know it's safe. Well, hopefully Amazon will make sure that's the case. That's where it's going to get interesting. The whole trust thing again. You have all these amazing, I bought something on Facebook and it was counterfeit, and that happens. And so I think it's up to those retailers to get a better hold of the distribution outlet or the companies that they partner with. But when they get it right, it can be really powerful.
It's interesting how you see how all the categories and channels swim together. You just talked about Facebook as a retailer, right?
It's a retailer,
the world is changing constantly. Now, I guess some people would say it's great that everyone's going for this BAV data and hanging on your lips because I'm doing the zagging. I'm doing exactly the opposite. I've seen conversations around the only data that really matters is the so-called microdata, which is verbatims drawn from that data and insights drawn from that. And in terms of positioning, the only positioning that counts is far away from everyone else. Do you see that as kind of a counterpoint to what you have, or is that captured somewhere in your system?
Yeah, so I think you can tap into the consumer language around the brand, and that's really important, but it's only a piece of the picture. At the same time, you can be a brand like Walmart.
And do you tap into the language itself of the consumer?
Oh, we do something we call language audits. We'll take, I think we have a slide here that's a little bit technical, which is, because it is technical. We will look
Well, you've got PhDs and master's degrees. I wouldn't have expected anything else.
Yeah, I have coders now. I never had coders 5 years ago. I have coders working for us now.
Yes.
Because the problem with social is there's so much data.
Right.
And how do you organize it?
Too
much data. So, fortunately, there's AI, and you can reduce that data if you know how to. And again, having organizing principles like BAV helps us to do that. What we do with language is we look and we take millions upon millions of conversations around a brand or around a topic like healthy living, and we factor analyze it basically through artificial intelligence, and we can reduce millions of conversations down to 10 themes related to a category. And we call that a language audit because it's about understanding what you're saying about yourself in social media, what consumers are saying about you, what your competitors are saying about you. All those pieces are relevant. And all those pieces should be used to help shape your brand in the marketplace.
Right. I have one more question here that I want to make sure we cover because it's an interesting one from Tim. And he says, do you cover business-to-business brands? What's your thinking? For example, he says, give us Boeing as an example.
Boeing
is a meaty one right now,
it's a meaty one. It's a brand in crisis, obviously. We do a lot of work with brands in crisis. It's like because we can look at brands that recovered from crisis. I think BP did a great job of that. Other brands, Wells Fargo, I don't know. We'll see. So you have to tap into how people are talking about the brand and what they're thinking about around it. It's tricky though. It's finding that space, finding that voice, and making sure that it's clear and making sure it's authentic. I can't talk enough about authenticity. We talk about being different and being relevant and how they're at odds. Authenticity drives both, right? If you're true to yourself, if you find your inner DNA that's at its best, and then you're a shiny object, and you can do that and create a deeper connection, as we would say, with consumers.
Right. I guess it gets me to what I often tell students, which is, data and models and processes, they're there to help you. They're tools. They're an aid to judgment. But at the end, particularly marketing, even though it wants itself to be a science, there's still a lot of humanity involved, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. We talk about
Consumers,
authenticity.
yes.
Yeah.
Consumers
Science
are
and
human.
intuition. You have to. I find it much easier for to work on a U.S. brand than to work on a brand in China. We do because I get it intuitively first. Because as with any research and analytics, you have to have hypotheses. You have to have ideas to think about because, in truth, with statistics, as you know, you can tell 5 different stories with the same data. It's about finding the truth in the brand, and sometimes you have to understand other realities that aren't in that data.
Right.
And
Which was actually
Yes.
another question. We only have a couple of minutes, but it was, are your scores global? And then if they're not, how do you differentiate a Tide in China from a Tide in
Sure.
the US?
They are not global. We do it by, I can create global averages. I would do it.
Are they meaningful global
Well, it
averages?
depends. If you're Disney and you're in the same place all around the world, then that's meaningful because you're consistent. But many brands are upper left in one country, lower right, so averaging it is washing out the truth.
Right. So that's the kind of,
So
Buick is a luxury brand in China, and here it was almost defunct.
So you have to understand its local market equity. And it may be, we work with a lot of global brands. Sometimes it's okay in these markets, it's about building esteem and building credibility. In these markets, it's about re-energizing. So there might be different challenges. We try to look at a brand globally and bucket into key areas or key regions where you have to do different strategies, ideally to try to get to the same place. But sometimes you're starting from a very different point in a different market, and you need to understand that. You can't, Coca-Cola can't be about heritage if it's like in another market when it's not part of their heritage. So you have to make sure you understand those truths.
Right, right. I know who asked this question. It's always the same, which is you consult with brands, you give insights to brands that you find. Where do you find your own insights and inspiration when you look at this data? Do you have sources that you look at beyond BAV? Would you keep the finger on the pulse?
I would say for me, just in culture, looking around, going to museums, going to concerts, or looking around me, seeing what's happening in culture, Instagram, social media.
Talking to my kids, looking at what.
Yes.
You have to be inspired. Oh, no question about it. I mean, the data tells you a lot, but you have, keeping a pulse of reality. It inspires me. If I'm just looking at the data with my head down, I would be doing the same things that we were doing with BAV 20 years ago.
Thank you. You give me a good excuse.
Yeah.
I keep telling my wife I'm going to the museum because it's
please.
my work.
Yeah,
Please.
absolutely.
And I chatted with my kids. I learned so much about Fortnite.
Yes.
Oh, we did it.
And
we
how-
did something with
Oh,
Lenny's.
you did a
Yes.
all these rituals, all these cults, the emote dances at the end of a win, etc., which are a world in itself that you could miss if you're of a certain generation that's not totally on discourse and the messaging systems that they use to exchange. We found it so interesting. We included it as a case study in our book, and literally I had my 13-year-old as a co-author on that
that's great.
part
That's
because
great.
he spoke the language. So you agree that you need to be in tune with what's going on,
Absolutely.
particularly when it's not of your own generation or your own product use, etc.
No question.
Understanding the
that.
reality across generations.
Excellent, excellent. Well, with that, I think it's a great ending. I want to thank you guys
Thank
for
you for having
coming.
us.
If people are interested, want to know more, I think you actually have a feature where they can hack in your brand,
Sure, you get-
their brand rather, and,
Yes.
and get a peek.
Sure. We have a
preview?
sampling of our data. If you go
Okay.
to www.bavgroup.com, there's a place you can go to say, and I think you can look at 3 brands at a time and get a feel for them. I don't think it's a full list of 4,000.
Of
in the
course
US.
not.
I'd be out of business. It's a U.S. data there. But if anybody wants to find out more, you can reach us. I think my email's there.
And there are people as well.
We measure
in this-
people. We
yes.
measure candidates. We predicted Donald Trump was
I
going
have
to
to
win.
look this.
I
I have to look this up.
Yeah,
yes.
we have it's interesting to see the equity of people, and sometimes you see the leaders are the most fascinating. Like you look at Steve Jobs, he had equity
Right.
that was sometimes stronger than
Which
Yeah.
the brand
Right.
probably depended on for a large
Absolutely.
part, particularly when it came back. Well, thanks again,
Thank you.
Sandrine,
Thank you.
Michael, for
Thank
coming,
you.
and you, dear listeners and watchers. You can. We want to thank you for being here, first of all, and then you can always look at the library of our podcasts and other webinars coming up. There's a particular one I want to pitch with Jim Stengel, where we're going to talk about purpose and about innovation and how to bring innovation back into a big company, which kind of relates to trying to dial the clock back as we just talked today. So stay up to date and also get some of those credits on top of it. Thank you very much for tuning in today.